Hercule Poirot and Mystery. At the Café Without Lights. Chapter 1. The Invitation in the Fog. The fog clung to London like a conspirator's cloak, muffling the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the distant cries of newsboys. Inside his impeccably ordered apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat by a crackling fire, a delicate porcelain teacup balanced in his hand. The symmetry of the room, polished mahogany table, neatly arranged books, and a single vase of white roses reflected the precision of his mind. It was a Tuesday evening in November, and the chill of the season had settled into the city's bones. A sharp rap at the door broke his reverie. His landlady, Mrs. Hudson, entered, bearing a silver tray with a single letter. "This came for you, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her tone tinged with curiosity. "Delivered by hand, no less, and in such weather." Poirot's moustache twitched as he took the envelope. It was of fine cream vellum, sealed with a wax stamp bearing no crest, only a faint impression of a candle. The handwriting was elegant, almost theatrical, with sweeping loops that suggested both urgency and secrecy. He slit it open with a pearl-handled letter-opener and read, "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation as a man of singular intellect precedes you. There is a matter at the Café Without Lights, a humble establishment at 17 Ravens Lane, that demands the attention of your little grey cells. Come tonight, if you please, and let the shadows guide you to the truth. A table awaits. Yours in Mystery, a friend, no signature, no return address." Poirot's green eyes gleamed with intrigue. A challenge, cloaked in anonymity, was precisely the sort of puzzle that stirred his soul. The name Café Without Lights was unfamiliar, yet its peculiarity piqued his curiosity. Why a café without lights? And why summon him, Hercule Poirot, to such an obscure corner of London? He glanced at the ormolu clock on the mantel. 7 o'clock. The fog would thicken by the hour, but Poirot was not one to shrink from inconvenience. He donned his heaviest overcoat, adjusted his Homburg hat, and selected a polished ebony cane. "Mrs. Hudson," he called, "I shall return late. Do not wait up." The journey to Ravens Lane was a study in patience. The hansom cab crawled through the fog, its driver muttering about cursed weather. Street lamps glowed feebly, their light swallowed by the mist. At last the cab halted before a narrow street, its cobblestones slick with damp. "Here's Ravens Lane, sir," the driver said, pointing to a shadowed alley. "Mind your step." Poirot descended, his cane tapping a steady rhythm as he navigated the uneven path. Number 17 was a modest building, its facade unremarkable save for the absence of any exterior light. No lantern hung above the door, no glow spilled from the windows. A weathered sign, barely legible, read, "Café Without Lights." The air carried a faint scent of coffee and wax mingled with the metallic tang of fog. He pushed open the heavy oak door, and a small bell jingled faintly. Inside, the café was a world unto itself. The interior was dimly lit by clusters of candles, their flames flickering on tables and shelves, casting a warm but unsteady glow. The walls were lined with dark wood panelling, adorned with faded paintings of Parisian street scenes. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted beans and the murmur of hushed voices. A thin man with a neatly trimmed beard approached, his black suit impeccable despite the café's rustic charm. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume," he said, his voice smooth with a faint French accent. "I am Monsieur Dubois, the manager. Your table is ready." Poirot inclined his head. You were expecting me, n'est-ce pas? The letter, it was most intriguing. Dubois' smile was polite but guarded. We are honoured to host a man of your reputation. Please, this way. He led Poirot to a corner table, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. A single candle burned at its centre, its flame steady despite the draught. From this vantage point, Poirot could observe the entire room. The clientele was small but varied. A young man with dishevelled hair, sketching furiously in a notebook. A stern older gentleman in a military-style coat, sipping brandy. And a woman in a dark veil, her face obscured, who sat alone, her gloved, hands folded around a cup of tea. Their conversations, if they could be called that, were conducted in whispers, halting abruptly whenever Dubois or the waiter, a wiry man with sharp eyes, passed by. Poirot ordered a tisane, his preferred drink, in such settings, and settled into his chair. His eyes, keen as a falcon's, took in every detail. The nervous tremor in the young artist's hand, the rigid posture of the older man, the way the veiled woman's head tilted as if listening to something beyond the room. The absence of electric lights was striking. Every other café in London blazed with gas or electricity, yet here candles reigned supreme. When he inquired, Dubois offered a practised explanation. A tradition, monsieur. The candles create an ambiance. Our patrons cherish it. C'est curieux, Poirot murmured, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. A café without lights, yet it draws such a particular crowd. Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, who sent the letter? Dubois' smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I know nothing of a letter, monsieur. Perhaps one of our patrons recommended you. Poirot did not press further. The lie, if it was a lie, would reveal itself in time. For now, he contented himself with observation. The café was a stage, its players unaware, or perhaps all too aware, of the drama unfolding. The candlelight cast long shadows, and in those shadows Poirot sensed a mystery waiting to be unravelled. As he sipped his tisane, a sudden chill ran through him. Not from the draught, but from the realization that someone in this room, perhaps watching him even now, had summoned him here for a purpose. And Hercule Poirot, with his little grey cells, was determined to discover what that purpose was. Chapter 2. Shadows at the Counter. The Café Without Lights seemed to hum with a quiet intensity as Hercule Poirot settled into his second evening at the peculiar establishment. The candles, perched on every table and tucked into wall sconces, cast a golden glow that flickered with each passing draught, creating shadows that writhed like spectres across the dark wood panelling. The air was heavy with the scent of brewed coffee and melting wax, underscored by a faint, inexplicable tension that Poirot's keen senses could not ignore. His corner table, strategically chosen, offered a clear view of the room, and he sat with his tisane, observing the players in this curious drama. The clientele was much the same as the previous night, though their behaviours had sharpened in Poirot's memory. The young artist, whom he had overheard addressed as Victor, hunched over his notebook, his pencil moving in frenetic bursts. His eyes darted nervously, as if expecting an unwelcome interruption. Across the room, the stern gentleman, Colonel Hargreaves, Poirot, had learned from a discreet inquiry to Monsieur Dubois, sat with a glass of brandy, his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping the café like a sentinel. The veiled woman, still an enigma, occupied her solitary table, her gloved hands cradling a cup that had long gone cold. Her veil obscured her expression, but Poirot noted the slight tilt of her head, as if she were attuned to every whisper in the room. The waiter, Pierre, moved with a practised grace, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He delivered drinks and cleared plates with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical, yet Poirot sensed a watchfulness in him, a man who saw more than he spoke. When Pierre passed Poirot's table, he paused to refill the tisane, offering a polite smile. "Another quiet evening, Monsieur Poirot?" he asked, his voice light but probing. "Quiet, perhaps," Poirot replied, his moustache twitching, but not without interest. "The candlelight, it reveals much, n'est-ce pas? The shadows, they tell their own stories." Pierre's smile tightened, and he inclined his head before moving on. Poirot made a mental note. The waiter was guarded, perhaps, complicit in the mystery that had drawn him here. He turned his attention to the other patrons, cataloguing their habits. Victor's sketches were not mere doodles. They were detailed, almost obsessive, capturing the café's ambiance with an artist's eye. Colonel Hargreaves, despite his military bearing, seemed ill at ease, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his glass. The veiled woman, whom no one addressed, was a cipher, her presence both conspicuous and ignored. At a table near the counter sat a new figure, a man in a grey coat who had not been present the previous night. He was unremarkable, middle-aged, with thinning hair and a pinched expression. But Poirot noted his solitude. The man sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the candle before him, as if lost in thought. His hat, placed carefully on the chair beside him, bore a faint monogram. J.L. Poirot filed this detail away, sensing that every element in the café, however small, might hold significance. The evening wore on, the murmur of conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of porcelain or the soft rustle of Victor's pencil. Poirot was about to signal Pierre for another tisane when a sudden crash shattered the quiet. It came from the back of the café, near the counter, followed by a sharp, feminine scream that cut through the air like a blade. The patrons froze, their faces illuminated by the flickering candles, each expression a study in shock or suspicion. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, his cane tapping as he moved toward the source of the noise. Monsieur Dubois emerged from behind the counter, his face pale, a damp cloth in his hand. "A mere accident," he said quickly, his voice strained. A glass slipped from Pierre's tray. "Nothing to concern you, mesdames et messieurs." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. A shattered glass lay on the floor, its contents pooling in a dark stain. Pierre stood nearby, wiping, his hands on his apron, his expression unreadable. The scream, Poirot deduced, had come from the veiled woman, who now sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly. But his attention was drawn to the table where the man in the grey coat had been sitting. It was empty. The coffee cup remained, half full, steam still rising from its surface. The hat was gone, and the chair was slightly askew, as if abandoned in haste. "Where is the gentleman who sat here?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but firm, addressing Dubois. Dubois blinked, his composure faltering. "Gentleman? I did not notice him leave. Perhaps he stepped out for air." Poirot's gaze swept the room. The other patrons had resumed their activities, though their movements were stiff, their glances furtive. Victor's pencil had stilled, and he stared at the empty table with a look of unease. Colonel Hargreaves drained his brandy in one swift motion, his jaw tight. The veiled woman's head was bowed, her veil concealing any reaction. "C'est curieux," Poirot murmured, returning to his table. He sat, his fingers steepled, his mind racing. The crash, the scream, the missing patron. It was no coincidence. The Café Without Lights was a stage, and someone had orchestrated this moment. Was the man in the grey coat a victim, a conspirator, or a phantom conjured by the shadows? And why had the scream come from the veiled woman, who seemed to know more than she revealed? As the candles burned lower, casting longer shadows across the room, Poirot felt the weight of unseen eyes. The letter that had summoned him here had promised a mystery, and now, with the patron vanished and the cafe's secret stirring, he knew he was precisely where he was meant to be. The little grey cells, they were awake, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until the truth was illuminated, candle by candle. Chapter 3. The Waiter Who Knew Too Much. The Café Without Lights was quieter than usual on the third evening of Hercule Poirot's investigation, as if the previous night's disturbance had cast a lingering spell over its patrons. The candles burned steadily, their flames reflected in the polished surfaces of the tables, but the air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken unease. Poirot sat at his customary corner table, his tisane untouched, his green eyes fixed on the wiry figure of Pierre, the waiter, who moved through the room with the precision of a metronome. There was something about Pierre, his sharp glances, his measured silences, that suggested he was more than a mere servant of the café. Tonight, Poirot resolved to probe the depths of the waiter's knowledge. The room was sparsely populated. Victor, the nervous artist, was present, though his sketching had slowed, his pencil hovering over the page as if paralyzed by thought. Colonel Hargreaves occupied his usual seat, his brandy-glass cradled in one hand, his eyes distant yet alert. The veiled woman was absent, her empty table a stark reminder of the scream that had punctuated the previous evening. The man in the grey coat, whose sudden disappearance had sharpened Poirot's suspicions, had not returned, and his absence hung over the café like a question mark. Poirot signalled Pierre with a subtle gesture, and the waiter approached, his tray balanced effortlessly. "Monsieur Poirot, another tisane?" Pierre asked, his voice smooth but with a faint edge, as if testing the detective's mood. "Non, merci," Poirot replied, his moustache twitching into a faint smile. "But perhaps you will indulge me with a moment of conversation. The café, it is most unique. Tell me, Monsieur Pierre, how long have you served here?" Pierre's eyes flickered, but he maintained his composure. 5 years, monsieur. Long enough to know the regulars and their habits, and long enough, perhaps, to know the café's secrets. Poirot's tone was light, almost playful, but his gaze was piercing. Pierre set down his tray, leaning slightly closer, his voice low. "Secrets? This is a place of coffee and candlelight, monsieur. The only secrets are in the stories the patrons tell." Poirot nodded, undeterred. "C'est possible. Yet last night a man vanished from this very room. A crash, a scream, and poof, he is gone, leaving only a cup of coffee and a hat. You saw nothing, you say?" Pierre straightened, his expression guarded. "I was busy with the broken glass. Patrons come and go. I cannot watch them all." "Bien sûr," Poirot said, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. "But you are observant, Monsieur Pierre. A waiter must be, to anticipate needs. Tell me, this café without lights, why no electricity? In all of London, such a choice is eccentric." Pierre hesitated, then offered a practised answer. "A tradition, monsieur. The candles, They create an atmosphere. The cafe has been this way since before my time, since the 1890s, they say, when it was a haven for poets and dreamers, and perhaps for others? Poirot pressed, his voice soft but insistent. I have heard whispers of a scandal long ago, a tragedy perhaps, tied to this place. You know of it? Pierre's face tightened, and for a moment Poirot thought he might retreat. But the waiter leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. There are stories, monsieur. Old tales of a woman who disappeared, a rich man's daughter. Some say she was betrayed, others that she fled. The cafe was different then, a place where secrets were traded like currency. But that was before my time. I only know what the walls whisper. And what do the walls whisper now? Poirot asked, his eyes locked on Pierre's. Pierre's gaze darted toward the counter, where Monsieur Dubois was polishing glasses with studied indifference. They whisper of eyes in the dark, he said cryptically. Someone always watching, even when the candles burn low. Before Poirot could press further, a patron signalled for Pierre, and the waiter excused himself, leaving Poirot to ponder his words. Eyes in the dark, a poetic phrase, but one that suggested surveillance, perhaps a hidden observer within the cafe's shadowy confines. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together fragments. The anonymous letter, the missing patron, the scream, and now Pierre's guarded hints. The waiter knew more than he admitted, but was he a witness, a conspirator, or merely a man caught in the web of the cafe's past? Poirot's attention shifted to Victor, who was sketching with renewed intensity. The artist's eyes flicked toward. Pierre and Poirot noticed the faint outline of a figure in the notebook, a man with sharp features, eerily resembling the waiter. Victor's fixation on Pierre was no coincidence, Poirot decided. The artist had seen something, or perhaps knew something, that made him wary. As the evening progressed, Poirot observed Dubois, who remained behind the counter, his movements deliberate but his glances frequent. The manager's composure was a mask, Poirot suspected, concealing a deeper involvement in the cafe's mysteries. The absence of the veiled woman troubled him too. Her scream had been the catalyst for the previous night's chaos, and her absence tonight felt deliberate, as if she were avoiding scrutiny. A sudden movement caught Poirot's eye. Outside, the cafe's window, a shadow passed, a fleeting silhouette against the fog. It was gone in an instant, but Poirot's pulse quickened. Someone was watching, just as Pierre had implied. He rose, intending to investigate, but the door remained closed, and the street beyond was swallowed by mist. Returning to his table, Poirot steepled his fingers, his little grey cells whirring. Pierre's cryptic remarks had opened a window into the cafe's history, hinting at a scandal from the 1890s that might hold the key to the present mystery. The waiter was a gatekeeper of secrets, but whether he guarded them out of loyalty or fear remained unclear. The shadow outside, the missing patron, Victor's sketches, all were threads in a tapestry Poirot was determined to unravel. As the candles burned lower, casting long, wavering shadows across the room, Poirot felt the weight of the Café Without Lights secrets pressing closer. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct for truth, would follow the trail wherever it led. Chapter 4. The Locked Room Riddle. The Café Without Lights was cloaked in an uneasy calm, as Hercule Poirot arrived for his fourth evening, the flickering candles casting their familiar dance of shadows across the room. The events of the previous nights, the mysterious letter, the vanished patron, the scream, and Pierre's cryptic hints had woven a web of intrigue that Poirot's little grey cells were eager to untangle. Tonight, the café felt different, as if holding its breath, and Poirot sensed that the next clue was near. The usual patrons were present, their behaviours now etched in Poirot's memory. Victor, the artist, sat hunched over his notebook, his pencil scratching with a feverish intensity that suggested more than artistic passion. Colonel Hargreaves, his military bearing unyielding, sipped his brandy, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the counter where Monsieur Dubois stood, polishing glasses with a distracted air. The veiled woman had returned, her dark silhouette a stark contrast to the candlelight, her gloved hands folded tightly as if guarding secret. Pierre moved among the tables, his sharp eyes catching every movement, though he avoided lingering near Poirot's corner table. Poirot sipped his tisane, his gaze sweeping the room, when a peculiar sound broke the murmur of conversation. A rhythmic tapping, faint but insistent, coming from the back of the café. It was not the clink of glass or the creak of floorboards, but a deliberate, almost mechanical noise, like a finger drumming on wood. The patrons paused, their heads turning toward the source, and Poirot's senses sharpened. The sound emanated from a heavy wooden door near the counter, one he had noticed before, but assumed led to a pantry or storeroom. Monsieur Dubois, his face paling, stepped forward quickly. "It is nothing," he said, his voice too loud in the quiet room. "Old pipes, you see. They make such noises in the cold." Poirot rose, his cane tapping softly as he approached the counter. "Pipes, Monsieur Dubois," he said, his tone polite but probing. "A curious sound for pipes' nests. Perhaps we should investigate to set the patrons' minds at ease." Dubois hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the cloth he held. The tapping had stopped, but the tension in the room had not. Victor's pencil stilled, his eyes wide with unease. Colonel Hargreaves set down his glass with a deliberate clink, his gaze fixed on Dubois. The veiled woman's head tilted slightly, her veil concealing any expression, but Poirot noted the faint tremor in her hands. "Very well," Dubois said at last, his voice strained. "But it is only a storeroom, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing of interest." He retrieved a key from his pocket, its metal glinting in the candlelight, and led Poirot to the door. The other patrons watched, their curiosity mingling with apprehension, as Dubois unlocked the bolt with a heavy clunk. The door creaked open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit space filled with wooden crates, sacks of coffee beans, and shelves lined with dusty bottles. A single candle, placed on a high shelf, burned weakly, its flame casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Poirot stepped inside, his eyes scanning every detail. The air was musty, tinged with the scent of aged wood and something else. A faint floral note that stirred his memory. Jasmine, he realized, the same perfume he had associated with the veiled woman. The floor was scuffed, with faint marks that suggested recent movement, though the dust on the crates was undisturbed. The tapping had not resumed, and the room appeared empty, yet Poirot's instincts told him otherwise. "C'est curieux," he murmured, kneeling to examine the floor. "These marks, they are fresh, and this candle—" He gestured to the one on the shelf, its wick dark and cold. "You say it was lit earlier, Monsieur Dubois?" Dubois nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yes, I lit it myself this afternoon. It must have gone out." Poirot's moustache twitched. A candle did not extinguish itself without cause, not in a room with no draught. He approached the shelf, his fingers brushing the wax, which was still warm. "Non, monsieur," he said softly. "This candle was extinguished recently. And the jasmine, it lingers, does it not?" Dubois' eyes widened, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to the patrons, who had gathered near the doorway, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Victor clutched his notebook tightly, his knuckles white. Colonel Hargreaves stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The veiled woman remained at her table, but her head was turned toward the storeroom, her posture rigid. "Perhaps," Poirot said, addressing the group, "someone was here, someone who did not wish to be seen." The patrons exchanged glances, but none spoke. Dubois cleared his throat. "Monsieur Poirot, it is an old building. Sounds carry. There is no one here." Poirot inclined his head, his smile enigmatic. "Bien sûr. Yet the little grey cells, they are not so easily convinced." He stepped out of the storeroom, allowing Dubois to lock the door. But his mind was alight with questions. The tapping, the jasmine, the extinguished candle, they were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to a presence in the storeroom that had vanished as swiftly as the man in the grey coat. Was the storeroom a hiding place, a point of escape, or something more sinister? And why did the scent of jasmine, so distinctly tied to the veiled woman, linger in a room she had not entered? As the evening resumed, the patrons returned to their tables, their conversation subdued. Pierre served drinks with his usual efficiency, but Poirot caught him glancing at the storeroom door, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Victor resumed sketching, though his hand trembled, and Poirot made a mental note to examine the artist's drawings for clues. The veiled woman sipped her tea, her movements slow and deliberate, as if aware of Poirot's scrutiny. Sitting once more at his table, Poirot steepled his fingers, his thoughts racing. The storeroom was a new thread in the tapestry of the Café Without Lights, and the jasmine perfume suggested a connection to the veiled woman, whose scream had marked the disappearance of the grey-coated man. The tapping, he suspected, was no accident but a signal, a lure or a warning. Someone in the café, perhaps Pierre, perhaps Dubois, perhaps another, knew the truth behind the locked room riddle, and Poirot was determined to unlock it. As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the mystery deepening, its roots entwined with the café's dark past. The Café Without Lights was a place of secrets, and Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, would shine a light into its darkest corners. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Past. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a London sky of slate grey, but the mysteries of the Café Without Lights clung to Hercule Poirot's mind, like mist to the city's streets. The events of the previous evenings, the cryptic letter, the vanished patron, Pierre's guarded hints, and the perplexing storeroom riddle, had convinced Poirot that the café's secrets were rooted in its history. To unravel them, he needed context, and so he ventured to a small archive on Fleet Street, home to Miss Eleanor Price, a historian renowned for her knowledge of London's obscure corners. The archive was a cramped, book-lined room above a tobacconist's shop, its air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. Miss Price, a wiry woman with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense demeanour, greeted Poirot with a raised eyebrow. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "I've read of your exploits. What brings a detective of your calibre to my dusty shelves?" Poirot inclined his head, his moustache twitching with a polite smile. Mademoiselle Price, I seek the history of a place most curious, the Café Without Lights, at 17 Ravens Lane. Its shadows, they whisper of a past that may illuminate a present mystery. Miss Price's eyes gleamed with interest. The Café Without Lights? Oh, that's a tale worth telling. Come, sit. I'll fetch what I have. She led Poirot to a cluttered desk, where she retrieved a leather-bound folder labelled Ravens Lane Miscellanea. As she opened it, yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes spilled out, their edges brittle with age. The café, she began, was a fashionable spot in the 1890s, a haven for artists, writers, and the odd aristocrat. But in 1895, it became infamous for a disappearance that was never solved. Poirot leaned forward, his green eyes intent. A disappearance. Whodunit? Tell me more. Miss Price sifted through the clippings, selecting one from the Times, dated October 1895. Clara Beaumont, a young heiress, vanished from the café during a candlelit evening. She was 22, beautiful, and set to inherit a fortune. She arrived alone, which was scandalous enough for a woman of her station, and was last seen at a table near the centre of the room. When the candles were relit after a brief blackout, common in those days with faulty gas lamps, she was gone. Her silk glove was found on the floor, but no trace of her ever surfaced. Poirot's fingers steepled, his mind racing. A blackout, n'est-ce pas? And no witnesses, none who spoke up, Miss Price said, her voice tinged with scepticism. The café's owner, a Frenchman named Etienne Laurent, was questioned, but he claimed ignorance. The police suspected foul play, kidnapping, perhaps or worse, but Laurent fled to the continent before they could press him. The case was hushed up, likely to protect the Beaumont family's reputation. The café changed hands, but its reputation never recovered. Miss Price handed Poirot a faded photograph, its sepia tones capturing the café's interior circa 1890. A group of patrons sat around a central table, their faces blurred but their attire elegant. The table bore an ornate candle holder, strikingly similar to the one Poirot had seen in the present-day café. This was taken before the scandal, Miss Price said. Notice the candle holder. It's said to be a fixture, never removed. Poirot studied the photograph, his eyes narrowing. C'est intéressant. The café, it retains its traditions even now. No electric lights, only candles. And this scandal! There were no suspects, no clues beyond the glove. Miss Price shook her head. Rumours, mostly. Some said Clara ran, off with a lover. Others that she was betrayed by someone close. There were whispers of a secret society meeting at the café, but nothing was proven. The Beaumont family offered a reward, but it went unclaimed. She paused, her expression grave. Be careful, Monsieur Poirot. Places like the Café Without Lights have long memories. The shadows there, they don't let go easily. Poirot thanked her, tucking the photograph and a copied clipping into his pocket. As he stepped back into the bustle of Fleet Street, Miss Price's warning echoed in his mind. The café's past was a mirror to its present, and the disappearance of Clara Beaumont bore an unsettling resemblance to the vanishing of the man in the grey coat. Returning to the café that evening, Poirot found it bathed in its usual candlelit glow, the air thick with the scent of coffee and wax. Victor was at his table, sketching with a distracted air, while Colonel Hargreaves sipped his brandy, his eyes scanning the room. The veiled woman was present, her posture as enigmatic as ever. Pierre moved among the tables, his sharp gaze meeting Poirot's for a fleeting moment before darting away. Poirot settled at his corner table, his thoughts on the photograph. He ordered a tisane, and as Pierre delivered it, casually inquired about the central table's candle holder. "A fine piece, non? It has been here many years, I think." Pierre nodded, his expression neutral. "As long as the café, monsieur. A relic of the old days." "Vraiment," Poirot murmured, his eyes on the candle holder. As Pierre moved away, Poirot reached for a menu, and a folded piece of paper slipped from its pages. A second photograph, nearly identical to Miss Price's, but with one chilling difference. A figure at the table had been scratched out, their face obliterated by angry, criss-crossing lines. Poirot's pulse quickened. The photograph was no accident. Someone had placed it for him to find, or perhaps to warn him. The scratched-out figure suggested concealment. A deliberate act to erase a person from the café's history. Was it Clara Beaumont, or someone connected to her disappearance? And how did it tie to the man in the grey coat? The storerooms, jasmine scent, or the veiled woman's scream? As the candles flickered, casting long shadows across the room, Poirot felt the weight of the café's past pressing closer. The whispers of 1895 were alive in the present, and the Café Without Lights was a stage where history played out anew. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct for truth, knew that the photograph was a key, and he would not rest until he uncovered the face it sought to hide. Chapter 6. The Artist's Secret Sketch. The Café Without Lights hummed with its usual undercurrent of tension as Hercule Poirot arrived for his fifth evening, the candlelight casting a restless glow across the room. The mysteries piling up, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine-scented riddle, Pierre's cryptic hints, and the chilling photograph with its scratched-out figure, had sharpened Poirot's resolve. His little grey cells buzzed with the certainty that the café's secrets were close to surfacing, and tonight his attention turned to Victor, the nervous artist whose feverish sketching had become a focal point of suspicion. The café was as Poirot had come to expect, a stage of shadows and whispers. Colonel Hargreaves sat in his usual spot, his brandy glass catching the candlelight, his stern gaze occasionally flickering toward the counter where Monsieur Dubois stood, his movements mechanical. The veiled woman was present, her dark silhouette, equals a constant enigma. Her gloved hands folded around a cup of tea that remained untouched. Pierre glided between tables, his sharp eyes missing nothing, though he avoided lingering near Poirot, perhaps sensing the detective's growing scrutiny. Victor, however, was the evening's study. The young artist sat hunched over his notebook, his pencil moving in erratic bursts, his face pale and drawn. His eyes darted nervously, not toward the other patrons, but inward, as if wrestling with a private fear. Poirot had noted Victor's fixation on Pierre the previous night, his sketches capturing the waiter with an almost obsessive detail. Now, as Poirot watched, Victor's hand trembled, and he quickly flipped a page when Pierre passed by, a gesture that did not escape the detective's notice. Poirot rose, his cane tapping softly as he approached Victor's table, his demeanour one of polite curiosity. "Monsieur Victor, n'est-ce pas?" he said, his voice warm but calculated. "I could not help but admire your dedication to your art. The candlelight, it inspires you, oui?" Victor started, his pencil clattering to the table. "Oh, yes, Monsieur Poirot," he stammered, his eyes wide. "The light, it's unique. It changes how you see things." "Vraiment," Poirot said, settling into the chair opposite Victor, without waiting for an invitation. "May I see your work? An artist's eye. It captures truths the rest of us overlook." Victor hesitated, his hands hovering protectively over the notebook. But Poirot's gaze, steady and encouraging, coaxed him into compliance. With a reluctant nod, Victor opened the notebook, revealing a series of sketches that took Poirot's breath away with their precision. The cafe's interior was rendered in stark detail. The ornate candle holder, the shadowed panelling, the patrons, faces caught in moments of unguarded emotion. Pierre was depicted with uncanny accuracy, his sharp features accentuated by dark, slashing lines. Colonel Hargreaves appeared in another sketch, his stern profile framed by a halo of candlelight. But one drawing stopped Poirot cold. It showed the veiled woman, her face partially visible beneath the veil, holding a small ornate key. The sketch was unfinished, the lines around her face cross-hatched, as if Victor had struggled to capture her features. More disturbingly, a shadowy figure loomed behind her, its form indistinct but menacing, a spectre not present in the cafe's visible reality. "C'est remarkable," Poirot said, his voice low. "You draw not only what you see, but what you feel, non? This figure, this shadow, who is it?" Victor's face paled further, and he closed the notebook with a snap. "It's nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just imagination. The shadows here, they play tricks." Poirot leaned closer, his tone gentle but insistent. "Monsieur Victor, the shadows may play tricks, but your pencil does not lie. You have seen something, or perhaps know something, that makes you afraid. Tell me, what is it?" Victor's eyes darted toward the counter where Pierre was serving a patron, then back to Poirot. I can't," he whispered. "It's not safe, but I saw a light once in the storeroom, late at night after closing. It wasn't a candle. It was wrong." "Wrong?" Poirot pressed, his eyes narrowing. "How so?" Victor swallowed, his voice trembling. "It flickered, but not like a flame, like something alive. I didn't stay to find out. I ran." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The storeroom again, with its jasmine scent and extinguished candle. Victor's fear was genuine, and his sketches suggested a perception beyond the ordinary, a glimpse into the cafe's hidden truths. To gain his trust, Poirot offered a calculated revelation. "Monsieur, I too seek the truth behind this cafe's shadows. There was a disappearance here long ago, a young woman named Clara Beaumont. Her story, it lingers, non? Perhaps what you have seen is connected." Victor's eyes widened, and for a moment Poirot thought he might speak. But the artist shook his head, clutching his notebook tightly. "I don't know anything about that," he said, his voice strained. "Please, leave me alone." Poirot rose, his smile enigmatic. "Bien sûr. But the truth, it has a way of finding the light, Monsieur Victor." Returning to his table, Poirot steepled his fingers, his thoughts swirling. Victor's sketches were a window into the cafe's secrets, capturing details that went beyond mere observation. The shadowy figure, the key in the veiled woman's hand, the wrong light in the storeroom. They were clues, each pointing to a deeper conspiracy. Victor's fear suggested he was a witness, perhaps unwittingly, to something dangerous. Was he sketching to document the truth, or to exercise his terror? As Poirot sipped his tisane, he noticed Pierre watching Victor from the counter, his expression unreadable. Dubois, too, seemed preoccupied, his glances toward the storeroom door, more frequent than usual. The veiled woman remained still, but Poirot sensed her awareness of the room's dynamics, her silence a shield for her own secrets. The candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, and Poirot felt the Café Without Lights closing in around him. Victor's sketches had added a new layer to the mystery, linking the present to the past, the storeroom to the veiled woman, the shadows to a truth that someone was desperate to conceal. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, knew that the artist's fear was a key, and he would unlock its secrets before the night was through. Chapter 7. The Colonel's Confession. The Café Without Lights was steeped in its usual amber glow as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 6th evening, the candles casting restless shadows that seemed to mirror the unease in his mind, the accumulating clues, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine-scented mystery, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, and Victor's haunting sketches had woven a complex tapestry of intrigue. Each thread pointed to a deeper truth, and tonight Poirot's focus turned to Colonel Hargreaves, the stern whose stern demeanour and guarded glances suggested a man burdened by more than military discipline. The café was as enigmatic as ever, its candlelit ambiance a stage for secrets. Victor sat at his table, sketching with a subdued intensity, his eyes occasionally darting toward the storeroom door. The veiled woman was present, her veiled silhouette a silent sentinel, her gloved hands clasped around a cold cup of tea. Pierre moved with his usual precision, though Poirot noted a slight tension in his movements, as if he sensed the detective's scrutiny. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his polishing cloth moving in slow, distracted circles. Colonel Hargreaves occupied his customary seat, his brandy glass catching the candlelight, his posture rigid as if braced for battle. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the room, lingering on Dubois and the storeroom door. Poirot had observed the Colonel's unease, his terse responses, and the regimental insignia on his cufflinks, which matched a symbol in Victor's sketches. Tonight, Poirot resolved to probe the Colonel's past, sensing that his presence in the café was no coincidence. Poirot approached Hargreaves' table, his cane tapping softly, his smile polite but probing. "Colonel Hargreaves, n'est-ce pas?" he said, settling into the opposite chair without waiting for an invitation. "A man of your experience must find this café most curious. The shadows, they hide much, non?" Hargreaves' jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "It's a place to think, Monsieur Poirot. Quiet, unassuming." "Vraiment," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "Yet it is not so quiet of late. A man vanishes, a storeroom whispers, a photograph conceals a face. You have been here many evenings, Colonel. Have you not noticed these disturbances?" Hargreaves took a slow sip of brandy, his fingers tight around the glass. "I keep to myself," he said gruffly. "People come and go. I don't pry." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but insistent. "Mais non, Colonel. A man of your training, he observes. He knows. The Café Without Lights, it has a history, oui? A scandal, long ago, tied to its first owner, Etienne Laurent. A man you may have known, perhaps." Hargreaves' eyes narrowed, and for a moment Poirot thought he might dismiss him. But the brandy, or perhaps a need to unburden, loosened his tongue. "Laurent," he said, his voice low. "I knew of him. A charmer, but a rogue. Ran the café in the 90s when I was a young officer. It was a place for discreet meetings. Secrets were bought and sold, and Laurent was at the heart of it." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Secrets, vous dites? Of what nature?" Hargreaves hesitated, his gaze drifting to the candle's flame. "Military secrets sometimes. Documents that could ruin men. Laurent had a knack for procuring them. There was a scandal. A document went missing, one that could have sparked a diplomatic crisis. Laurent was blamed, but he vanished before the truth came out. Poirot's mind raced, connecting the Colonel's tale to Clara Beaumont's disappearance. And this scandal, he said, it was tied to the café, to a young woman perhaps. Clara Beaumont, who vanished in 1895? Hargreaves' hand trembled, and he set the glass down with a clink. "You've done your homework, Poirot." Yes, Clara was part of it. She was involved with someone, or so the rumours went. When she disappeared, people said Laurent had spirited her away, or worse, but I never believed it. Laurent was a schemer, not a murderer. "C'est intéressant," Poirot murmured. "And you, Colonel, why do you come here, to this place of shadows, if not to seek answers?" Hargreaves's face hardened, but his voice betrayed a flicker of guilt. "I come to remember. To atone, perhaps. I was young, arrogant. I knew things back then that I should have spoken of. But I kept silent, and Clara paid the price." Poirot studied him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers traced the insignia on his cufflinks. "Mon ami, silence is a heavy burden. What did you know?" Hargreaves shook his head, his voice barely audible, enough to know the café isn't what it seems. "There's a debt here, Poirot, and someone's still paying it." Before Poirot could press further, he caught movement at the counter. Dubois was arguing with Pierre in hushed tones, their words inaudible, but their gestures sharp. Hargreaves noticed, too, his eyes narrowing, and he drained his brandy in one swift motion. "Leave it, Poirot," he said, rising. "Some truths are better left in the dark." As Hargreaves returned to his seat, Poirot remained at the table, his thoughts swirling. The Colonel's confession, though guarded, was a revelation. His connection to Laurent and the 1895 scandal placed him at the heart of the café's history, and his guilt suggested a personal stake in the current mystery. The insignia, the stolen document, Clara's disappearance, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Hargreaves was a key. Poirot's gaze shifted to Victor, whose sketching had paused, his eyes fixed on Hargreaves with a mix of fear and recognition. The veiled woman, too, seemed attuned to the exchange, her head tilted slightly, her silence a mask for her thoughts. Pierre and Dubois had resumed their tasks, but Poirot sensed their argument was no trivial matter. As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights drawing him deeper into its past. Hargreaves' confession had illuminated a corner of the mystery, but it had also raised new questions. What had the Colonel kept silent about, and why did he return to the café to atone? Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, knew the truth was close, and he would not rest until the shadows yielded their secrets. Chapter 8. The Veiled Woman's Warning. The Café Without Lights was shrouded in an almost palpable tension as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 7th evening, the candlelight casting its familiar flickering glow across the room, the mysteries piling up, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic hints, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's haunting sketches, and Colonel Hargreaves's guarded confession had drawn Poirot deeper into the café's shadowy web. Each clue pointed to a truth buried in the past, and tonight his attention turned to the veiled woman, whose enigmatic presence and sudden scream had marked the mystery's early moments. The café was a study in contrasts. the warm glow of candles against the cold undercurrent of suspicion. Victor sat at his table, his sketching subdued, his eyes darting nervously toward the storeroom door. Colonel Hargreaves, his military bearing as rigid as ever, sipped his brandy, his gaze occasionally meeting Poirot's with a flicker of unease. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his movements mechanical, while Pierre glided among the tables, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The veiled woman occupied her solitary table, her dark veil obscuring her face, her gloved hands folded tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane steaming before him, his green eyes fixed on the veiled woman. She had been a constant presence, yet an enigma. Her scream during the patron's disappearance, the jasmine scent linking her to the storeroom, and Victor's sketch of her holding a key all suggested she was more than a bystander. Tonight, Poirot sensed she was watching him, her head tilted slightly, her silence a shield for secrets. As the evening wore on, the café grew quieter, the murmur of conversation fading to a hush. Poirot was about to signal Pierre when the veiled woman rose, her movements slow and deliberate. To his surprise, she approached his table, her veiled face unreadable, her steps silent on the worn floorboards. She stopped before him, her gloved hands clasped, and spoke in a low, urgent whisper that sent a chill through him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice soft but laced with fear, "you must leave this place. Your questions, they stir shadows that should remain untouched. If you persist, the lights will go out forever." Poirot's moustache twitched, his eyes narrowing. "Madame, your warning, it is most intriguing. But Hercule Poirot, he does not flee from shadows. Tell me, what is this danger you speak of?" She hesitated, her gloved fingers tightening. Then, with a swift motion, she slipped a small, ornate key from her sleeve and pressed it into his hand. The key was cold, its intricate design worn with age, its metal glinting in the candlelight. "This unlocks the truth," she whispered, "but beware, monsieur. The truth is a flame that burns." Before Poirot could respond, she turned and glided toward the door, her dark figure blending with the shadows. He rose, intending to follow, but she was swift, slipping out into the foggy street beyond. By the time Poirot reached the door, the mist had swallowed her, leaving only the faint echo of her footsteps on the cobblestones. He returned to his table, the key heavy in his palm. Its design was elaborate, with delicate filigree that suggested craftsmanship from decades past. Was it the key to the storeroom, or to something else entirely? A hidden compartment, a locked box, a secret tied to the café's history. Poirot's mind raced, connecting the key to Victor's sketch, to the jasmine scent, to the veiled woman's warning. He signalled Pierre, who approached with his usual composure. "Monsieur Pierre," Poirot said, his tone casual but probing. "The lady who was here, the one with the veil, she is known to you, oui?" Pierre's eyes flickered, but he nodded. "We call her Madame L. She comes and goes, always alone. A private woman, monsieur." "C'est curieux," Poirot murmured. "And tonight she leaves in haste. You saw nothing unusual?" Pierre shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Nothing, monsieur. She paid and left, as always." Poirot dismissed him, knowing the waiter's reticence hid more than it revealed. He turned his attention to the other patrons. Victor had paused his sketching, his eyes fixed on the door through which the veiled woman had vanished, his face pale. Colonel Hargreaves drained his brandy, his jaw tight, as if the woman's departure had stirred some memory. Dubois, behind. The counter, polished glasses with a distracted air, his glances toward Poirot more frequent than usual. Sitting once more, Poirot examined the key, his fingers tracing its contours. The veiled woman's warning, "The lights will go out forever," echoed Pierre's earlier hint of eyes in the dark, suggesting a looming danger tied to his investigation. Her role was unclear. Was she an ally, warning him of peril, or a player in the cafe's conspiracy, seeking to deter him? The key, he suspected, was a deliberate clue, perhaps meant to guide him to the heart of the mystery, or to lure him into a trap. As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights closing in around him. The veiled woman's warning had heightened the stakes, and the key in his hand was a tangible link to the cafe's secrets. The scratched-out photograph, the storeroom's mysteries, Hargreaves' confession, and Victor's sketches, all converged on this moment, and Poirot knew the truth was within reach. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, clutched the key tightly, determined to unlock the secrets of the Café Without Lights before the shadows claimed their due. Chapter 9. The Candle That Never. Burns the Café Without Lights was steeped in its usual amber glow as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 8th evening, the candles casting their restless shadows across the worn wooden floors. The weight of the mysteries, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's eerie sketches, Colonel Hargreaves' confession, and the veiled woman's ornate key, pressed heavily on Poirot's mind. Each clue was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and tonight his attention was drawn to a peculiar detail he had overlooked: the central candle on the cafe's main table, which seemed to burn eternally without ever diminishing. The cafe was a familiar stage, its players locked in their silent dance. Victor sat at his table, his sketching subdued, his eyes flickering nervously toward the storeroom door. Colonel Hargreaves, his military posture unyielding, sipped his brandy, his gaze occasionally meeting Poirot's with a guarded intensity. The veiled woman was absent, her empty table a stark reminder of her cryptic warning, and the key now tucked safely in Poirot's pocket. Pierre moved with his usual grace, his sharp eyes catching every movement, while Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his polishing cloth moving in slow, distracted circles. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane steaming before him, his green eyes fixed on the central table. The candle there was unlike the others, thicker, taller, and oddly pristine, its wax unmarred despite burning night after night. It stood in the ornate candle holder from the 1895 photograph, its flame steady, casting a warm glow that seemed to anchor the room. Poirot had noticed it before, but dismissed it as a decorative quirk. Now, with the veiled woman's key and the cafe's secrets piling up, he suspected it held more significance. During a lull in the evening, when the murmur of conversation had faded, Poirot rose and approached the central table, his cane tapping softly. He leaned close to the candle, his fingers brushing its base, and confirmed his suspicion. The wax was cool, unyielding, as if it had never melted. "C'est curieux," he murmured, his moustache twitching. A candle that burned without consuming itself was no ordinary object. It was a clue, perhaps a mechanism. With a glance to ensure no one was watching, Poirot gently twisted the candle's base. To his surprise, it clicked, revealing a hidden compartment within the holder. Inside was a tightly folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. He slipped it into his pocket, his pulse quickening, and returned to his table, his demeanour calm to avoid drawing attention. Seated once more, Poirot unfolded the paper under the cover of his tisane cup. It was covered in a series of symbols, circles, lines and crosses that formed a code interspersed with a few legible words: keeper, flame, and beneath. The symbols resembled those in the 1895 photograph, particularly around the scratched-out figure, suggesting a connection to the café's past. Poirot's mind raced, deciphering the code's structure. It appeared to reference a meeting place within the café, possibly beneath the floor or a hidden space, and the keeper of the flame hinted at a guardian of secrets, perhaps Dubois, Pierre, or even the veiled woman. To test his theory, Poirot observed the staff. Dubois, behind the counter, seemed preoccupied, his glances toward the central table more frequent than usual. Pierre, serving a patron, paused near the candle, his hand brushing its base as if checking something. Their subtle attention to the candle confirmed Poirot's suspicion. It was a covert communication device used to pass messages or signal events. Poirot's thoughts turned to the veiled woman's key. Could it unlock the beneath referenced in the note? Perhaps a trapdoor or hidden compartment tied to the candle holder. The jasmine scent in the storeroom, Victor's sketch of the key, and Hargreaves' tale of a stolen document all pointed to a conspiracy rooted in the café's history, with the candle as its silent sentinel. As the evening progressed, Poirot noticed Victor watching the central table, his pencil hovering over his notebook. The artist's fear was palpable, and Poirot wondered if he had seen the candle's secret in his late-night glimpse of the wrong light. Colonel Hargreaves, too, seemed restless, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his glass, his eyes lingering on the candle holder. Pierre and Dubois exchanged a brief, hushed conversation at the counter, their words inaudible, but their tension clear. Poirot steepled his fingers, his little grey cells whirring. The candle that never burned was a master stroke of concealment, hiding its secrets in plain sight. The coded note suggested a planned rendezvous, or a guarded truth, and the keeper of the flame was likely a key figure in the café's conspiracy. Was it Dubois, orchestrating from behind the counter? Pierre, with his knowing glances? Or the veiled woman, whose key and warning tied her to the heart of the mystery? As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights drawing him closer to its core. The coded note was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. What lay beneath, and who was the keeper guarding it? Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, knew the candle's secret was a step toward the truth, and he would not rest until he illuminated the darkness. Chapter 10. Footsteps in the Alley. The Café Without Lights was cloaked in a restless hush as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 9th evening, the candlelight casting its familiar, wavering glow across the room. The mounting clues, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's eerie sketches, Colonel Hargreaves' confession, the veiled woman's key, and the coded note hidden in the eternal candle had drawn Poirot ever deeper into the cafe's shadowy web. Each discovery tightened the threads of the mystery, and tonight his senses were alert for the next revelation. The cafe was a stage of subdued tension. Victor sat at his table, his sketching erratic, his eyes darting toward the central candle holder, as if it held a threat. Colonel Hargreaves, his military posture rigid, sipped his brandy, his gaze flickering between the counter and the storeroom door. The veiled woman was absent, her empty table a silent echo of her warning. The ornate key she had given Poirot, now a heavy presence in his pocket. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his movements slow and distracted, while Pierre glided among the tables, his sharp eyes catching every nuance, though he avoided Poirot's gaze. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane steaming before him, his mind replaying the coded note's cryptic phrases. Keeper, flame, beneath. The candle that never burned was a linchpin, he was certain, signalling a hidden space or a guarded secret within the cafe. The key, the jasmine, the storeroom's tapping, all pointed to a conspiracy tied to the 1895 disappearance of Clara Beaumont, and Poirot sensed the truth was close. As the evening wore on, the cafe grew quieter, the murmur of conversation fading to a low hum. Poirot was about to rise and examine the central candle holder again, when a sudden sound pierced the stillness. Hurried footsteps, sharp and uneven, echoing from the alley behind the cafe. The noise was faint but unmistakable, like someone running or pacing in the fog-shrouded darkness outside. Poirot's pulse quickened. He rose, his cane tapping softly, and moved toward the cafe's rear door, which led to the alley. The other patrons noticed, their heads turning, but none followed. Victor's pencil stilled, his face paling, while Colonel Hargreaves sat down, his glass with a deliberate clink, his eyes narrowing. Dubois at the counter froze, his polishing cloth suspended, while Pierre paused mid-step, his expression unreadable. Poirot pushed open the rear door, the cold night air rushing in, heavy, with the scent of damp stone and fog. The alley was narrow, flanked by high brick walls, its cobblestones slick with moisture. A single street lamp cast a feeble glow, its light swallowed by the mist. The footsteps had stopped, and the alley appeared empty, but Poirot's keen senses detected a disturbance. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ground, and spotted a glint of metal in the mud. A cigarette case, its silver surface engraved with the initials J.L. Poirot knelt, careful not to soil his coat, and retrieved the case. It was finely crafted, its edges worn, but its engraving clear. The initials J.L. stirred a memory, the monogram on the hat of the man in the grey coat who had vanished after the scream. Was this his, discarded in haste, or did it belong to another figure lurking in the cafe's shadows? Poirot pocketed the case, his mind racing. He returned to the cafe, closing the door against the chill, and approached Pierre, who was now clearing a table. "Monsieur Pierre," Poirot said, his tone casual but probing, "the alley behind the cafe. It is used often, oui?" Pierre's eyes flickered, but he shook his head. "Rarely, monsieur. Only for deliveries. It's a dead end, no reason for anyone to be there." "C'est curieux," Poirot murmured. "Yet I heard footsteps and found this." He held up the cigarette case, watching Pierre's reaction. The waiter's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened on the tray. "I know nothing of it, monsieur. Perhaps a passer-by." Poirot nodded, dismissing him, but his suspicions deepened. Pierre's composure was a mask, and the footsteps suggested someone had been watching, or fleeing. The next day, Poirot visited a high-end tobacconist on Bond Street, where the cigarette case's craftsmanship was traced to a select clientele. The shopkeeper, reluctant but persuaded by Poirot's charm, mentioned a shadowy figure known as the broker, a discreet operator in London's underworld who frequented Raven's Lane. The initials JL matched no known client, but the connection to the underworld intrigued Poirot. Back at the café that evening, Poirot observed the patrons with renewed intensity. Victor's sketching had resumed, but his hands trembled, and Poirot wondered if the artist had heard the footsteps too. Colonel Hargreaves seemed restless, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his glass, his eyes lingering on the rear door. Dubois and Pierre exchanged furtive glances, their tension palpable. Poirot steepled his fingers, his little grey cells whirring. The cigarette case was a tangible link to the vanished patron, and the footsteps suggested a living presence tied to the café's secrets. The broker's rumoured involvement hinted at a larger network, perhaps using the café as a hub for clandestine dealings, as Hargreaves had implied about the 1895 scandal. The coded note's reference to beneath and the veiled woman's key pointed to a hidden space, and the alley might be an escape route or a meeting point. As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights drawing him closer to its heart. The footsteps in the alley were a warning, a sign that the shadows were watching, and the cigarette case was a clue to a figure who moved unseen. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, knew the truth was near, and he would follow the trail through the fog until it led him to light. Chapter 11. The Night of No Shadows. The Café Without Lights was steeped in a brooding tension as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 10th evening, the candlelight casting its familiar wavering glow across the room, the weight of the accumulating clues, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's eerie sketches, Colonel Hargreaves' confession, the veiled woman's key, the coded note in the eternal candle, and the cigarette case from the alley, had drawn Poirot ever closer to the heart of the mystery. Each thread tightened the web of deception, and tonight the air felt charged with the promise of revelation. The café was a stage of heightened alertness. Victor sat at his table, his sketching erratic, his eyes darting toward the central candle holder, as if it held a silent threat. Colonel Hargreaves, his military posture rigid, sipped his brandy, his gaze flickering between the counter and the rear door. The veiled woman had returned, her dark silhouette a quiet enigma, her gloved hands clutching a shawl adorned with a sapphire brooch that glinted in the candlelight. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his movements slow and distracted, while Pierre glided among the tables, his sharp eyes catching every nuance, though he avoided Poirot's scrutiny. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane steaming before him, his mind replaying the coded note's cryptic phrases, keeper, flame, beneath, and the cigarette case's initials, JL. The veiled woman's key, now a constant weight in his pocket, seemed to pulse with promise. Perhaps the means to unlock the beneath referenced in the note. The footsteps in the alley had suggested a living presence, possibly the elusive broker, and Poirot sensed the café was on the brink of a dramatic turn. The evening progressed under a storm-heavy sky, the distant rumble of thunder adding to the café's unease. The candles burned steadily, their flames a fragile defence against the gathering darkness. Poirot was observing Pierre, noting his subtle glances towards the central candle-holder, when a sudden, inexplicable event shattered the calm. Every candle in the café, on tables, shelves, and the central holder, extinguished at once, plunging the room into total blackness. A collective gasp rose from the patrons, followed by shouts and the scrape of chairs. A woman's voice, likely the veiled woman's, cried out, sharp and panicked. Poirot, his senses honed, remained seated, his ears attuned to the chaos. Footsteps shuffled, glass clinked, and a muffled thud suggested someone had stumbled. Darkness was absolute. The café's lack of electric lights now a stark liability. The blackout lasted mere seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When Pierre and Dubois relit the candles, their flames sputtering back to life, the room was in disarray. Patrons stood or sat frozen, their faces pale in the renewed glow. Victor clutched his notebook, his eyes wide with fear. Colonel Hargreaves gripped his glass tightly, his jaw set. Dubois, at the counter, was flustered, muttering about a draught, while Pierre's composure seemed strained, his hands trembling as he lit the final candle. Poirot's gaze swept the room, cataloguing details. Then the veiled woman's voice broke the silence, sharp with accusation. My brooch!" she exclaimed, her gloved hands fumbling at her shawl. "The sapphire! It's gone!" The patrons turned, their eyes on her empty shawl, where only a torn thread remained. Poirot rose, his cane tapping as he approached her. "Table. Madame, you are certain it was taken just now, in the darkness?" She nodded, her veil concealing her expression, but her voice trembled. "It was pinned securely. Someone took it during the blackout." Poirot's mind raced, reconstructing the sequence of events. The blackout had been no accident. It was orchestrated, a calculated act to mask the theft. He turned to Dubois, his tone calm but firm. "Monsieur Dubois, you claim a draught extinguished the candles, yet the windows are closed, the door shut. C'est curieux, non?" Dubois stammered, his face flushed. A power surge, perhaps. The building is old." "Non," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. "This café has no electricity. The candles were extinguished deliberately. Someone wished to create chaos." He moved through the room, his senses alert. At Victor's table, he noted the artist's chair was slightly askew, as if he had moved during the blackout. Colonel Hargreaves's glass was nearly empty, suggesting he had remained seated, but his cufflinks glinted, one slightly loosened. Pierre had been near the central table when the candles went out, while Dubois had been behind the counter, closest to the storeroom door. Poirot addressed the patrons, his voice steady. "Mesdames et messieurs, a theft has occurred, and in this room someone knows the truth. The darkness, it was a cloak for a crime. But Hercule Poirot, he sees through the Shadows. The patrons exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke. Poirot returned to his table, his little grey cells whirring. The blackout was a bold move, timed to exploit the cafe's reliance on candles. The sapphire brooch, valuable and conspicuous, was a target, but was the theft the motive, or a distraction from a larger scheme? The coded note's reference to beneath and the veiled woman's key suggested a hidden space, and the blackout might have been cover for someone accessing it. As the candles burned lower, their shadows returning to dance across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights tightening its grip. The theft was a new layer in the mystery, linking the veiled woman's presence to the cafe's secrets. The footsteps in the alley, the cigarette case, and the eternal candle all pointed to a conspiracy, and Poirot knew the night of no shadows had revealed more than it concealed. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, would follow the trail until the truth shone clear. Chapter 12. The Truth Behind the Curtain. The Café Without Lights was cloaked in a heavy stillness as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 11th evening, the candlelight casting its familiar, wavering glow across the room. The mounting clues, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's eerie sketches, Colonel Hargreaves' confession, the veiled woman's key, the coded note in the eternal candle, the cigarette case from the alley, and the stolen sapphire brooch, had woven a dense web of intrigue. Each thread drew Poirot closer to the heart of the mystery, and tonight he sensed the café was poised to reveal one of its deepest secrets. The café was a stage of subdued tension. Victor sat at his table, his sketching nearly abandoned, his eyes fixed on the central candle holder with a mix of fear and fascination. Colonel Hargreaves, his military posture rigid, sipped his brandy, his gaze flickering toward the storeroom door as if expecting it to open. The veiled woman was present, her dark silhouette a silent enigma, her shawl now bare of the stolen sapphire brooch, her gloved hands clasped tightly. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his movements slow and distracted, while Pierre glided among the tables, his sharp eyes catching every nuance, though he avoided Poirot's scrutiny. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane steaming, before him, his mind replaying the coded note's cryptic phrases, keeper, flame, beneath, and the veiled woman's key, which he now carried like a talisman. The blackout and theft had been a bold escalation, suggesting a desperate attempt to conceal or retrieve something within the café. The cigarette case's initials, JL, and the footsteps in the alley hinted at an external player, possibly the elusive broker. But Poirot's instincts told him the answer lay within the café's walls. As the evening progressed, Poirot's attention was drawn to a heavy velvet curtain in the café's far corner, partially obscured by a coat rack. He had noticed it before, but dismissed it as decorative. Now, with the note's reference to beneath and the key's promise to unlock the truth, he suspected it concealed more than dust. Waiting until the patrons were distracted, Victor sketching, Hargreaves sipping, the veiled woman staring into her tea, Poirot rose, his cane tapping softly, and approached the curtain. He parted it cautiously, revealing a narrow wooden door, its surface worn but sturdy, with a small ornate keyhole that matched the veiled woman's key. His pulse quickened. Glancing back to ensure no one watched, he slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty corridor that descended into shadow. Poirot stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and lit a small pocket torch he carried for such occasions. The corridor was cramped, its walls lined with cracked plaster, its air thick with the scent of damp earth. It sloped downward, leading to a small, dusty room barely larger than a closet. The torch's beam revealed a chilling tableau. A blood-stained silk scarf, its fabric brittle with age, lay on a wooden crate. Beside it was a bundle of letters, their ink faded but legible, dated 1895. A silver locket, tarnished but intact, rested atop the pile, its clasp engraved with the initials C.B. Poirot's heart raced as he opened the locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman, her features delicate, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Clara Beaumont, the heiress who vanished in 1895. He skimmed the letters, their frantic script speaking of betrayal and a promise kept in darkness. One mentioned a keeper who guarded a secret beneath the flame, echoing the coded note. The scarf, stained with what Poirot suspected was blood, suggested foul play, not a voluntary disappearance. Among the artifacts was a modern item, a torn ticket stub from a recent theatre performance at the Lyceum, dated only a week prior. Its presence was jarring, proof that the hidden room was still in use. Poirot pocketed the stub, the locket, and one letter, careful to disturb nothing else. The room was a time capsule, linking the cafe's past to its present, and the ticket stub suggested someone was actively guarding or exploiting its secrets. As he prepared to leave, a faint sound froze him. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the corridor. Poirot extinguished his torch and pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. The footsteps paused at the door, and he heard a muffled voice. Pierre's, low and urgent, speaking to someone unseen. "It's secure," Pierre said. "No one's been here." The second voice, too faint to identify, murmured a reply, and the footsteps retreated. Poirot waited, his heart pounding, until silence returned. He slipped back into the corridor, relocking the door, and emerged behind the curtain, his composure intact. The café was unchanged, the patrons unaware of his discovery, but Poirot's mind was alight with revelation. He returned to his table, his little grey cells whirring. The hidden room was the beneath of the coded note, a repository of evidence tied to Clara Beaumont's fate. The blood-stained scarf and letters pointed to a crime, possibly murder, orchestrated by the keeper mentioned in 1895. The ticket stub suggested a modern conspirator, Dubois, Pierre, or even the veiled woman using the room to maintain the café's secrets. The cigarette cases, J.L., and the broker's rumoured presence hinted at an external force, perhaps exploiting the café's history for profit or revenge. Poirot observed the patrons with renewed intensity. Victor's sketching had stopped, his eyes fixed on the curtain, as if he sensed its significance. Colonel Hargreaves drained his brandy, his jaw tight, his cufflinks glinting in the candlelight. The veiled woman's head was tilted, her silence a mask for her thoughts. Pierre and Dubois exchanged a glance, their tension palpable. As the candles burned lower, their shadows stretching across the walls, Poirot felt the Café Without Lights yielding its deepest secret. The truth behind the curtain was a bridge between past and present, and the artifacts in his pocket were keys to unlocking the mystery. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring instinct, knew the final act was near, and he would shine a light into the café's darkest corners before the night was through. Chapter 13. The Final Candle. The Café Without Lights was bathed in an almost solemn glow as Hercule Poirot arrived for his 12th and final evening, the candles casting their familiar, wavering light across the room, the weight of the accumulated clues, the vanished patron, the storeroom's jasmine scent, Pierre's cryptic warnings, the scratched-out photograph, Victor's eerie sketches, Colonel Hargreaves' confession, the veiled woman's key, the coded note in the eternal candle, the cigarette case from the alley, the stolen sapphire brooch, and the hidden room's chilling artifacts, had brought Poirot to the precipice of truth. Tonight he would unravel the mystery that had drawn him to this shadowed stage, and the Café Without Lights would never be the same. The café was a tableau of anticipation. Victor sat at his table, his notebook closed, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and expectation. Colonel Hargreaves, his military posture rigid, sipped his brandy, his gaze locked on Poirot as if sensing the denouement. The veiled woman, her dark silhouette a quiet enigma, sat with her gloved hands folded, her shawl bare of the stolen brooch. Monsieur Dubois stood behind the counter, his movements slow and nervous, while Pierre glided among the tables, his sharp eyes betraying a flicker of unease. The central candle, the eternal flame that never burned, stood as a silent sentinel, its secrets now known to Poirot. Poirot settled at his corner table, his tisane untouched, his green eyes surveying the room. In his pocket he carried the veiled woman's key, the coded note, the cigarette case, the locket with Clara Beaumont's portrait, the blood-stained scarf, and the theatre ticket stub from the hidden room. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and his little grey cells had woven them into a coherent picture. Tonight he would gather the players and reveal the truth, using the café's candlelit stage to expose the culprit. As the evening reached its quietest hour, Poirot rose, his cane tapping softly, and addressed the room with a calm authority. Mesdames et messieurs, Hercule Poirot have been summoned to this Café Without Lights by a letter promising a mystery. And what a mystery it has been! A web of shadows, secrets and sins stretching from 1895 to this very night. But the time for shadows is over. Tonight, the truth will be illuminated. The patrons froze, their eyes on Poirot. Victor clutched. His chair, Colonel Hargreaves, set down his glass. The veiled woman's head tilted. Dubois paled, and Pierre paused mid-step. Poirot gestured to the central table, where the eternal candle burned. "Let us gather here, s'il vous plaît, and I shall explain." Reluctantly, they complied, forming a tense circle around the candle-holder. Poirot began, his voice steady, his hands weaving the story. "It begins with Clara Beaumont, an heiress who vanished from this café in 1895. Her disappearance was no accident, no. She was betrayed, her life taken in a hidden room behind a curtain, where a blood-stained scarf and letters bear witness to her fate." He produced the scarf and locket, laying them on the table. The patrons gasped, and Dubois flinched. These were guarded by a keeper of the flame, as a coded note revealed, hidden in this very candle holder. The note spoke of a place beneath, which I found, a room where Clara's secrets were kept. Poirot turned to the cigarette case, its initials JL glinting. The man in the grey coat, whose disappearance marked my first night here, was no random patron. He was James Langley, known as the Broker, a figure in London's underworld seeking to exploit the cafe's secrets for profit. His cigarette case, found in the alley, proves his presence, and his sudden exit suggests he knew too much. He held up the veiled woman's key. This, given by Madame L, unlocks the hidden room, but also the truth. Madame L, you are no bystander. You are Eleanor Beaumont, Clara's cousin, driven by guilt to uncover her fate. Your scream, your brooches, theft, they were signals, to draw attention to the cafe's darkness. The veiled woman nodded, lifting her veil to reveal a face lined with sorrow. I knew Clara was murdered, she whispered. I've watched this place for years, waiting for justice. Poirot's gaze shifted to Victor. Monsieur Victor, your sketches captured the truth. The key, the shadows, the wrong light in the storeroom. You saw Pierre tampering with the candle holder, no? Your fear kept you silent, but your art spoke. Victor nodded, trembling. I saw him hide something. I didn't know what to do. Poirot turned to Colonel Hargreaves. Colonel, you knew of Etienne Laurent's schemes in 1895. You kept silent about Clara's betrayal, and your guilt brings you here, seeking atonement. But you are not the keeper. Hargreaves bowed his head, his voice heavy. I should have spoken then. I failed her. Finally, Poirot faced Pierre and Dubois, his eyes piercing. The keeper of the flame, the orchestrator of this mystery, is among us. Monsieur Dubois, you play the nervous manager, but it is Pierre who guards the secrets. Pierre, you are Laurent's grandson, oui? You maintain the cafe's dark legacy, using the candle holder to pass messages, the hidden room to hide evidence. The blackout, the theft, they were your doing, to distract from Langley's discovery of the room. Pierre's composure cracked, his eyes blazing. You can't prove it, he spat, lunging for the door. But Poirot had anticipated this. Colonel Hargreaves, with surprising agility, blocked Pierre's path, and Victor grabbed his arm. It's over, Poirot said. The letters name Laurent as Clara's killer, driven by greed for her fortune. You, Pierre, protected his legacy, silencing Langley and stealing the brooch to fund your escape. But the truth, it cannot be extinguished. Pierre slumped, his defiance crumbling. Dubois, shaken, confessed to aiding Pierre out of fear, unaware of the full extent of his crimes. Eleanor wept, her quest for justice fulfilled. The patrons, stunned, watched as Poirot laid out the final pieces. The coded notes meeting place, the ticket stubs proof of Pierre's recent visits to the room, and the jasmine scent tying Eleanor to her cousin's memory. As the central candle burned, its flame steady, Poirot concluded, the Café Without Lights is a place of secrets, but no secret can hide from Hercule Poirot. The past is avenged, and the shadows are banished. The patrons dispersed, Pierre in custody, the café forever changed. Poirot stepped into the foggy London night, his heart light. The final candle had burned true, and the truth, like a flame, had illuminated all.